Welcome to Bottled Petrichor. In this new series, we sit with experts and learn how to navigate tools and resources necessary for students and researchers in Islamic Studies. Our expert today is Dr. Martin Nguyen, Chair of the Religious Studies Department at Fairfield University, and he will be talking to us about how to write properly in Islamic Studies. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
The doctor is actually my neighbor somewhat, and I've just benefited from him so much in so many different ways, and so I'm super happy to have him on today, and I'm confident that whoever's listening will benefit from him as much as I have. So again, I'm very happy to have you on, Doctor. Before we start, do you mind telling us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Properly speaking, I was trained in Quranic studies, the study of tafsir. My early research was very much within that realm. I looked at what you might call the early classical tradition. Since then, I've broadened my research to really both study and actually do theology. And so, I've had the benefit of two writing projects, major writing projects at this point. My dissertation, which became a book, but then my second work, Modern Muslim Theology, which is more reflective of the trajectory I'm going on now. And when we spoke about, the podcast series, what crossed my mind as possibly being really beneficial is not necessarily talking about the subject matter of what I work on, but on the craft of writing. I find it a bit of an irony, or maybe it's an oversight, that when you actually look at graduate programs for Islamic studies, or even most realms of academia, especially in the humanities, so little time is spent on kind of two major components of our careers. One is teaching, and the other one is writing. Here we are expected to do copious amounts of research and dedicate years of our life to collecting information, to analyzing it, and then to crafting the dissertation, which will hopefully, right, God willing, become a book. And while, it's not as if graduate programs are inattentive to the task of writing, it's secondary or tertiary. It's kind of assumed that as a student, you're going to absorb things along the way. But it really wasn't until I was in my position at Fairfield University as a junior scholar, right? I was an assistant professor at the time, that I attended a seminar, or actually a series of workshops that the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning was hosting. I was part of a cohort of fellow faculty members that were trying to progress towards that goal of tenure. And it was during those meetings that I really came to appreciate that writing is something we've overlooked. We were all struggling to kind of get our publications out, to polish our dossiers, to kind of build our careers. But one of the mentors, one of the facilitators at that workshop took the time to really talk to us about writing. And so I want to kind of put here at the beginning kind of my citations for what I'm about to share. I'm using several works and one resource, right, as kind of my inspiration for the guidance I'm offering now. There are two books that I would suggest if people are interested in writing. One is by Stephen King. It's called On Writing. Stephen King, the famous horror popular writer. This book is part memoir, part kind of instruction or guide for the craft of writing. And even if you don't pull too much out of it in terms of guidance on writing, it's utterly fascinating to read. He's a gifted writer, and now you can read something by King that's not horror. The other book is a very old book by Peter Elbow called Writing with Power. This is a book that is just kind of replete with different ways, techniques of how to shape your writing and how to become a better writer. This is a book you can kind of flip through and take what you want and dismiss what you find kind of irrelevant or unhelpful to you. The title can be a bit off-putting. What does it mean to write with power? It seems a bit aggressive. But his point is that we write with the greatest authenticity when we find our voice. And I think that's actually a valuable goal to have in mind. But my major citation, I am most indebted to a mentor of mine from that workshop, and who's kind of been there for me throughout my career. Her name is Kwok Pui Lan. She's a professor of post-colonial theology, Christian theology, works on feminism. She works on kind of Asian American theologies. And so not in Islamic studies at all whatsoever, but I benefited immensely from her taking the time to walk us through her own journey, her own experiences, and sharing her advice, right, about what does it mean to be a good writer? How do we actually become good writers? And so many of the things I'll be sharing today draw upon those sessions with her and things that I have kind of learned in my own kind of process of developing as a writer scholar. And of course, there has to be a caveat, right? Writing is a highly individual task. Each of us has our own process that we flourish in different ways. And so there's many things here that you may find absolutely unhelpful. Nevertheless, I'm hoping that there'll be things of benefit, things that you can walk away with to help kind of hone your own craft. Because these are things that I've found of benefit. And so just to kind of circle back to that point, right, is that so little time is spent on writing. I mean, our advisors, they will read over our papers, they will, offer their comments, but the majority of that attention and focus is on concepts and ideas, historical accuracy. Are we following the trends and expectations of the genres within our field? And it's only almost as an afterthought, and sometimes not at all, that our instructors, our teachers, our professors will actually comment on the way we express ourselves. And I think it's getting better. There are certainly departments and certainly instructors, advisors out there who are being a bit more attentive to writing, because one of the reasons we need to invest in this skill is we need to get published, right? Presses, of course, want to get our research out there if they think there's an audience for it. But it becomes much more appealing if we can kind of demonstrate to them that we actually have the facility to write, the ability to express ourselves to non-expert audiences. And when I say non-expert audiences, I'm not just talking about the general population, right? There are people in Islamic studies who may want to read about what you're writing, right, on the Quran, but they're doing ethnographies of Muslims of a Muslim society, or they're working on Islamic law, and they don't have that specialization. So, in what ways can we make ourselves more accessible? And writing is one of the main, really kind of primary vehicles for conveying the work that we do, which is why I think, right, this taking some time to think about writing is so important. And so, kind of at the very top of things, I would say you have to think of writing, and I've said this a couple of times already, as a skill, but not just as a skill. It's more like an art form. It's a craft. There's not people who are suddenly gifted, talented writers at the outset. Everyone who's a good writer takes the time to develop that discipline. That there's a certain degree of commitment, of rigor, of consistency, and there will be ups and downs. That you will learn the ins and outs. You will have failures, and you will learn from them to become a better writer in the end. And so, one of the key things I think to the craft of writing is to make it a consistent practice. When you think about graduate programs, when you think about early career, you're oftentimes focused on projects. I need to get this particular seminar paper out. I need to get this particular chapter complete, or I need to publish this book or get the proposal tied up. And so all of a sudden, our writing is pinned to particular deadlines, where what is of greater benefit is actually making writing a routine. And so that means blocking off time every single day to write, not simply because you have a project in mind, but because you yourself want to focus on writing. Because as you're going to learn, right, as all of us will learn, our careers are shifting. We have a great deal of time as graduate students, but then we have a whole different set of responsibilities and different types of time commitments when we're early career professors, different kinds of administrative asks upon us when we become associate and chairs and what have you. And what we used to have before in our lives in terms of time to write is going to shift dramatically, right? Personal situations and scenarios will change. And so part of developing as a writer is just trying to say, here's an immovable block of time that I'm going to have every day to write. And this is based upon your own preference. For me, I'm an early riser. I like to get up quite early in the morning before everyone else is up and just to sit and write. Even if it's 15 minutes, that keeps me in the habit of writing. For others, it might be something in the middle of the day, perhaps after teaching or after instruction, after classes. For others, it may be in the wee hours of the night when the rest of the household have retired. But the point is, you need to put in that time. And even if you don't have a specific deadline to meet, you should be writing something, right? So that's one of the things that I think is very helpful. I think the another kind of vivid anecdote that comes from the Stephen King book on writing is about training yourself to also write under any circumstances. Stephen King relates this whole incident of how he bought this beautiful, huge mahogany desk, and he created this perfect writing office, a space for him to write. And yet, when he sat in that space, he found it difficult, right? There was different types of pressures on there, and we can think about our own kind of preferences, right? That, oh, I need to be in a quiet study, Carol, or I need to be at a cafe with a quiet buzz in the background, but not too much. And I think this creates, in a sense, a hurdle, an unnecessary hurdle for us as writers. That one of the things that we need to pair with that consistency of writing is the ability to write anywhere. That whether we're on a commuter train, right, going to campus, or whether we're on a plane in a busy, noisy, right, airport or cafe, whether we're staying with family, right, because of some situation like the COVID pandemic, we need to be able to kind of force ourselves to write under any situation, so we can maintain that consistency, so that we can flourish when the need arises. And I say all of this not to say that we should be more productive writers in sort of odd capitalist fashion, but if we are committed scholars and teachers, right, writing is something that we should be growing in, because it helps us become better advocates and better researchers, better teachers. And so, we have to think about writing consistently, being able to write everywhere. Those are kind of two of the first things to establish. I think in addition to that, we can also think about writing, the different styles of writing that there actually are. I think about the first work that I did, the dissertation, major work that I did, the dissertation, right? That was a project that was written for my dissertation committee. It was written for their expectations, what they were looking for, and needed to pass whatever bar they had set. Once I had to craft a book proposal and thinking about presses, all of a sudden my notion of audience shifted, and that's the whole revision process with bringing the dissertation to a book. And again, right, you're now thinking, well, now things need to look different. And how can you actually craft that? If I could give myself some advice, right, back then, is I would write the dissertation. I would tell my younger self not to write the dissertation simply for that dissertation committee, but to imagine, right, my hoped for audience down the line. What does that look like? Who am I really trying to reach? What impact or change am I trying to make or convey or help prompt, facilitate? And then write for those audiences. Oftentimes, I think there is this strong compulsion to adopt the jargon, the specific lexicons of our subfields. And while there is importance in that, I also think there's an increasing importance for accessibility of language. This isn't saying you have to choose either or. It's a way of trying to navigate how to bring both to the table, right? If there's a lexical term, if there's a specific, coinage that you want to use because it has significance, then of course use it, but then take the time to make sure it is accessible, comprehensible to your readership. One of the pieces of advice that was given to me by Quy Lan, right, is when you write anything, you should always try to imagine a narrative arc to it. And what's interesting is that she picked up a lot of this from going to kind of fiction writing workshops. So, you have to imagine here's a theologian and an academic, a scholar, sitting alongside fiction writers, but benefiting, right, from the guidance that they're providing. And when you think about a narrative arc, the reason you create an arc is to ensure that there's a certain logical structure to what you're writing, but you're trying to help your reader get from point A to B to C, that you have an idea of where you want them to land. And so how do you best facilitate that process? That you also want them to have certain concepts, that you want them to be able to take your words and carry them forward from chapter to chapter or from point to point. And so when you think about the narrative arc of your work, it's not just about how can I get them from this concept to that concept to this conclusion. You also want to think, well, how can I capture their attention? That there's this added component of appeal. And so I think also significant to the craft of writing is trying to be a bit imaginative, to think a bit unconventionally outside the box when it comes to writing, which means that, yes, in your dissertation, you have a review of literature that kind of sits at the beginning of your book. But that may not be where you want to actually begin the dissertation that becomes a more wide readership, monograph. You may actually want to think about reorganizing pretty radically that piece of scholarship that you built. Maybe what you thought was, the high point of your dissertation should actually be the opening for your book. And even for the chapters that you write when trying to put monographs together, don't dive right into the findings, into the text. Are there stories? Are there anecdotes? Ways to hook your readership, to draw them in and have them commit to the book that you're writing. I think one of the things that is a bit misleading is that when you think about dissertations and monographs in academia, so often we assume that the reader that comes to the book is automatically committed. Oh, they have to be reading this because they're also experts in Islamic law, and regardless of how roughly communicated my work is, they'll take the time to read it and appreciate what's going on. I think that's a bit of a misleading assumption because as so many of us know, when we have to review texts, when we have to kind of write book reviews, it can be extremely difficult, right? The ideas in a book can be absolutely fascinating, but if the author cannot communicate it, you have that author has suddenly limited their reach, limited their ability to convey the significance of their findings. And so when you're thinking of a narrative arc, are there ways of making your writing more accessible? Are there ways of making it more intriguing? And so, when you think about the narrative arc, I would try to imagine more unconventional ways of restructuring that text. Take a risk and see how you might reorganize that entire project. And of course, helpful for this is to create multiple documents, save multiple drafts, so that you can go back and say, well, that didn't actually quite work. Maybe I can try something else with the earlier drafts that I have written. On the point of drafts too, it could also be that the actual starting process of writing can be a bit of a hurdle. And so a common kind of piece of advice that is often given is to kind of not think about the readership right away. That has to come in at some point, right? But you can think of it as this, right? That there's really two things involved in the process of writing good articles and good books. There is writing and there is editing and revising. And while they're intimately related, they're actually very separate skill sets, different things that you can hone yourself in. And so in that regard, when it comes to writing, starting that process, there's actually this metaphor that Stephen King uses, right? That there's a time when you're writing with the door closed to the world. You're writing for yourself. You have this intuition, you have this sense that, there's this idea percolating. How can I get it onto paper before I lose it, before I lose the thread that is now kind of bumping around in my mind? Likewise, there's also the process of writing with a door open to the world. That you now have this kind of rough beginning. How can I refine it? How can I kind of disentangle the ideas and the knotty concepts that are in there? But when it comes to the initial draft, right, people often talk about something called the zero draft. That oftentimes what's helpful is not thinking about how do I start this book, but how do I get this concept from my mind onto paper? And the zero draft is written without any attention to readership, right? You turn off your spell check, you turn off your grammar check. You don't think about how people receive it. You are doing a service to yourself by simply trying to kind of pour out the idea in your head. It doesn't matter if it makes sense. Don't go back and read the previous sentences to see if it is coherent. Just write until you have it all out there. That's the zero draft. And then you can go back and you can revisit it and then finally write that first draft. But oftentimes that zero draft is just there for you to look at in its aftermath to figure out, is this something worthwhile? Is this workable? Is this something that I can actually use? I would also say, right, that in addition to that zero draft, we can also get caught up in different concepts, different ideas, different figures we're trying to focus on in our writing. And something that often it's been bandied about quite a bit in fiction writing circles is this phrase, the idea of murdering or killing your darlings. That there are moments when we're writing and we think, wow, this is a fantastic concept, or this is this figure that I've spent so much time researching. I finally crafted, right, this treatment of them or of this city, right, over this historical context. But you may realize when you revisit the narrative arc you're trying to build that this is extraneous. This actually doesn't help. This may add to the page count, but is it going to actually help in the ultimate goal or objectives of your book? And that's when you have to come to that hard decision, right? Is this worth keeping in, or does it lead your reader astray, right? And you have to kill your lovelies, you have to kill your darlings. And so, I mean, that can be hard to do because you've spent so much time on something. I have a chapter for my dissertation, which I took out. I never published it. It didn't go in the final form of the book. It's still sitting in a document, where I put it, but I had to do it at the time. Otherwise, I probably would have somehow shoehorned it into what was already going to be a pretty voluminous work. But it helped me kind of, trim the fat, so to speak. But I think that the book that emerged from the dissertation ultimately was for the better. But I needed the ability to kind of set aside a significant portion of work with the hope that, maybe one day I can revisit it. And who knows? God willing, maybe I will find an opportunity or the desire to bring that lost chapter to publication. But I think this is a strategy that we can use when we have to kind of kill those darlings. Just cut and paste those pieces that we agonized over, we spent so much time over, and put them somewhere else with the idea that maybe one day I can revisit it, one day I can rework it, one day I can bring it into another project. But for now, with what I'm trying to do, the narrative arc that I'm trying to tell, it has to go. And that can be one of the harder things to do when it comes to writing. I would also add then, right, there's many different strategies that people use for writing, right? There's the idea of writing multiple drafts and revisiting them. For me, I think one of the best things I can do is actually to read widely, and not just for content, but reading for style, reading to discover a beautiful writer. Because when you do come across good writing, even if it's in a field, right, that is tangential or even unrelated to what you're working on, you can actually find passages and try to kind of, in a sense, deconstruct them. Ask that question: what makes this passage so compelling? What is it about this particular phrase that seems to distill, right, this entire chapter into this summary statement? Taking the time to read widely is one way of discovering what good writing looks like, so that you can then bring it, right, to the table when you are actually in the process of writing. As I read widely, right, I oftentimes jot down quotes and phrases that I might want to use in whatever project I'm engrossed in, but I might not. The point is to collect these things and to revisit them, to become almost like an archive of what I see as good sample writing, things that are helpful, things that are useful. And over the years, I've developed quite a bank of these things, but it's always been kind of a help and inspiration. Oftentimes, to overcome a block, right, a hurdle of how should I write about this particular subject, I'll kind of unearth that document. Like, here are the quotations that I've kind of collected about migration, right, or displacement, and just reading that, these kind of distillations from other authors has been a helpful way of trying to kind of jumpstart my own writing process. So, if you're going to become a good writer, you need to kind of expose yourself to a wide array of other writers, to read broadly. And I think there's actually great benefit also in taking the time to read fiction. It's kind of hard to imagine, right? Because when you think about academia and scholarship and production, there is this capitalist drive to produce consistently, to do it for the sake of the job market, of promotion, that I can't afford to take the time to read this short story, to read a poem. And yet I have found that taking the time to kind of step away for a moment and immerse myself in a different type of reading and writing has been beneficial. Again, this may be of limited use to some, and others it may be helpful.
You had mentioned that writing 15 minutes a day, just every single day, is beneficial. Now, do you think
Yeah.
there's any value to, I mean, not just writing academic stuff for 15 minutes, just writing anything, maybe even writing short fiction, stuff
Uh,
like this?
oh, absolutely. In fact, if you spend those 15 minutes, maybe not on an academic piece of writing, but just something else, right? You just want to capture a story that, your mother would tell you as a child, or to write down a dream you write. I think what's helpful in doing those kind of unconventional types of writing, or maybe perhaps non-academic forms of writing, is that it helps you find your own voice. That your gift as a writer may not be right in the critical analysis writing that we praise or value so much in typical scholarship. It may be in the ability to recount a story. It may be the ability to kind of poetically capture a concept. And so when you take moments to kind of explore other genres, so to speak, that's a process of self-discovery, of where your strengths lie and perhaps areas that you could explore or refine as a writer. Okay, so just to kind of offer a few other kind of tips or pointers in terms of developing yourself as a writer. You may be struck with an idea, a concept or that perfect sentence, right, comes to you in the most unexpected place. I put myself in the habit of just having some sort of basic writing app that's on my phone that I can open up and jot down that idea in that moment. I may be walking through the grocery store when all of a sudden I'm thinking like, oh, this is how I can connect these two things, or here's a figure that I've researched in the past that I need to bring forward now. I'll just kind of pause and take the time to kind of jot it down in my phone. I also have the habit of having by my bedside, right, like a pen and paper, because it's usually when I'm drifting off, right, that all of a sudden that I'm like, oh, this is how I can phrase, this particular paragraph, or this is how I can kind of unearth this particular idea. And so, something to keep in mind is, again, along the lines of not trying to cultivate that perfect environment, just have that basic notebook, right? The one that's that cheap, inexpensive notebook, the pen that you've picked up at the doctor's office. Just have them nearby as implements, as tools that you can use to kind of capture what might strike you wherever you are. Because I think the other thing about writing is that if you make it consistent, your mind is going to be primed all the time to thinking through whatever it is that you're working on, or whatever it is that you perhaps just spent that 15 minutes on earlier in the day. I think one of the last things I need to mention, and this is something that I struggled with, is I have a streak of perfectionism. And I think that when you think about academia, many of us struggle with that, right? That we want things to be just right. We want things to kind of meet the standards that we've set, and those standards are high. And the problem is, when it comes to writing, perfectionism is perhaps one of the worst enemies to actually face. Perfection does not help you get things done, and to be honest, you need to get things done in academia. The dissertation is not your magnum opus. Do not spend unnecessary years trying to craft that perfect dissertation, because that dissertation really marks the beginning of your career, not the end of it. If it marks the end, then you've peaked, right? And likewise, when you're writing pieces, you don't need to have things exactly quite right. You'll be surprised that people can be quite receptive to what you may see as an imperfect draft. Because if the ideas are compelling, right? If the writing is moving in the right direction, you are getting closer to your end goal. And so you have to kind of first assess, right? Is perfectionism something that I'm dealing with? Is it something that is slowing down the entire process? And in what ways, right, can I, in a sense, navigate it? Right? It's not as if you can ever get rid of that impulse if you happen to have it, but it's to recognize that these are things that I can do to say that, what, I'm going to give myself this hard deadline. That this, by this day, whatever state that the piece of writing is in, I want to send it off to my friend, to my colleague, to have a look at it, right? Because at least by switching from the writing phase to the revising phase, I am moving the ball forward. I'm progressing down the field, right? To use a bit of a sports metaphor. And that's the other thing, right? That finding a partner in all of this can be helpful. I do know that in my kind of early career as a professor, it was very helpful, in fact, crucial to have a writing group And that writing group doesn't need to be fellow Islamic studies academics. I remember working with someone in political science and another in anthropology, in fields and realms far beyond what I was doing. But here's a set of outside eyes trying to make sense of, things that I was writing. And I was being exposed to what they were doing and their styles of writing at the same time. And so finding, a group to write with, or even a partner, to develop a sense of accountability when it comes to writing can be very helpful. Not to the point of a punishing accountability, but one that helps, spur you along, that actually encourages you that, I do need to take the time to work a bit on this article or on this draft, so that this other person can take the time to read it. Because they're actually going to take time to read through your work, to help you get better, to offer their comments. So there's this idea of looking for a circle to write with, of trying to step away from your own kind of perfectionism.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Good writing is more than just knowing, it's not from whence, it's just whence, or it's from whom and not, from who. It's also being able to clearly and concisely convey your argument and your ideas without being too verbose or anything like this. Keeping that in mind, who are academic authors right now that you think are people that students should emulate when it comes to the art and the craft of writing?
Yeah, and that's a great question, right? Like, who could you read? I've been struck by a Christian theologian, an ethicist rather, Stanley Hauerwas. He has written an immense amount of work. There must be dozens and dozens of articles and books that he's written over the course of his career. I mean, he is certainly a well-respected figure in those circles. But when you pick up his writing, you can tell, right, that he's really refined that craft. He's taken the time to write honestly, which actually reminds me of another piece of advice that I was given. Right, we are oftentimes trying to emulate, and I think this is how we all start off in any sort of art form. We imitate, we copy, we try to emulate somebody else's style. I know with my dissertation, I was trying to kind of model my work after Gerhard Böhring's book on Tusturi and Walid Saleh's book on Athalabi. And that was helpful for that kind of early phase and development of my kind of scholarly work. But where you want to end up, and this is kind of key to kind of discovering your voice, is to try to write as you actually speak. Right? Oftentimes we get caught up in this kind of weird expectation to write in this kind of stuffy, like jargon-laden language. Right? We talk like a discourse rather than in a more natural language. And there's something very compelling and very straightforward about trying to write in a way as if this is how I speak, and so this is how I'm going to write. You can always go back and refine it, revise it as necessary, depending on the venue and the audience you're aiming for. But that actually might be one way of facilitating the process of writing. So I mentioned Stanley Hauerwas as one figure that kind of jumped to mind. The other writer who I need to mention is Viet Nguyen, another Vietnamese scholar. He's an Asian American studies, but he's also a Pulitzer Prize winning novelist, right? He's the author of, what is it called? His new book is called Committed, which is the sequel to his first book, which won the Pulitzer. Why can I not recall that title? It's on my shelf. But reading Viet Nguyen, you can tell that his writing as a fiction writer flows into his scholarly writing, right? His major scholarly work is a book called Nothing Ever Dies. And it's about memory and forgetting and war. And he's really looking at Southeast Asia, especially Vietnam. But when you read that scholarly text, there are turns of phrases and there are sentences that are just beautiful, right? You can see the Pulitzer fiction writer also at work in this scholarly piece. And so that's somebody, again, completely outside of Islamic studies, but as I read him and his work, I was struck by that writing, and it's been formative. It's been informative to my own process, to how I write. You know, there's actually a lot of people popping into my head right now, but so many of them are actually not in Islamic studies, and I think it's telling. I will say that there are writers in our field who have made that conscious decision, right? That we need to write for broader audiences. Carl Ernst, for example, has been a strong advocate of this, and you see it in his recent publications, his more recent publications, where he's crafting his books in such a way that yes, he's conveying important, complex ideas, but trying to reach a broader readership than simply Islamic studies specialists. And these are things I think that we as a field need to be more conscious of. When you think about higher education, we are in an embattled position in a sense that that the work we see, we do is seen as obscure, a bit too eclectic, of limited significance, which of course I strongly disagree with. But we don't do ourselves a service, we do ourselves a disservice rather, when we don't pay attention to how we write. And so, I would just kind of lay out those three names there as just kind of good examples to turn to. I would simply kind of reiterate maybe at this point some of the things that I think we need to keep in mind, things that I think will be helpful to folks really trying to pay attention to writing, to treat it like a craft, something that requires work. All too often, oh, I remember what I was going to mention. It's the whole problem that is inescapable in academia. It's the imposter complex. I think a lot of us suffer from imposter syndrome. Here I am.
I've never heard of such a thing.
Oh, you haven't?
I'm just joking.
Okay, I can't see your screen right now, so I can't reach your. Yes, but yeah, of course, right? Who are we to be in academia? Who are we to be professors and instructors? And the thing about writing is it can be one of those feeders into that imposter syndrome. That I can't write. That I'm not a good scholar. I'm even like a bad person because I'm incapable of writing well. And I'm here to say that, right, if writing is a skill, all it does is take work. It takes practice. Anybody can become a good writer as long as they put in the time. Just like anyone can become a master chef. Anyone can become a talented musician if they put in the hours, if they develop the discipline to pursue that particular craft or skill. They can do it. And I think writing is no different, right? Writing is not bestowed from on high to only a select few. We all have the potential to do it. And what I've been trying to talk about, right, through this session are what I see as kind of key things to help us get or progress along the way. It's being able to write wherever you are, having things to write with wherever you are, and to write consistently every day. I mentioned 15 minutes, but if you can block off a half hour, an hour every day, more power to you. I would recommend doing what you think is a good fit. I would set a minimum though, right? At least 15 minutes every day. But if you happen to be in the flow of things, you can go for a good 2 hours. If you have the time to write for half the day, then do so. But don't skip, right? Don't do what you can to make up there a block of time, an immovable block of time every day. If you have shared calendars, maybe you put it in so that the other people that are scheduling around you, whether it's family or colleagues, know that, all right, for those 15 minutes or that half hour, this person's unavailable for meetings, unavailable for whatever duties. Of course, that may have to be negotiated when it comes to family, as it should be. Also, right, get into the right frame of mind when you write. There's times to write purely for yourself, to write that zero draft, to write to capture an idea and not to satiate an audience. But there's also times when you're writing for certain people in mind, certain groups, certain readerships. And so when you sit down to write, think first, who am I writing for at this moment in time? There'll be time enough to go back and revise and revisit, because editing is a different skill, a different craft, which also doesn't get really taught quite often, but is something that we acquire. And I think more could be said on that, just as more could be said on writing. And then I think the last piece of advice, the one that I have found the most valuable for my writing now, is to always think in terms of the narrative arc. Always think about where you're trying to go. The book I'm writing right now is very much structured with that in mind. And there are times when I've suddenly realized that suddenly the two chapters that I've been struggling with would flow better if I simply reverse the order, right? That I need to kind of put chapter 4 in the position of chapter 3 and to wait and to delay chapter 3 to the chapter 4 position. And when I made that decision, all of a sudden things began to fall into place. And so, right, it is sometimes worth taking the risk to think outside the box, to create drafts where you're radically shifting things around, to see what might come of it. The beauty of all this technology today is that we can save multiple drafts, that we can go back into our histories and see that, oh, here's a previous version that I worked on before that actually worked better. Or maybe, you know, taking this risk actually paid off. In the end, you just simply cannot give up. That writing is something that all of us can do quite well. We just simply need to figure out what is our voice and how can we best, you know, refine that skill.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Doctor. Before we conclude, do you mind telling us a bit about some of the projects that you're currently working on? Anything of this nature?
Yes. So, you know, I'm actually working on two things at the moment. One hasn't been officially announced yet, but I can speak about it here because we're so close to finishing. We have a book contract with Fortress Press. This is a book that Imam Suhaib Sultan and I began writing about a year and a half ago. As some of you may know, and for those who don't, Suhaib Sultan was the chaplain, coordinator of Muslim life at Princeton University. He passed away this past April when he was diagnosed with his terminal cancer about a year and a half ago, a little bit less than that. I finally sat down with him and said, you've written this master's thesis on the life and art of preaching, of delivering the Friday khutbah. And I, when I discovered his master's thesis topic years ago, had tried to convince him, like, can you publish this? And so with his terminal diagnosis, I sat with him and said, can we work on this together? Can I help you get this into the world? And so for this past year, I've been editing and revising that work. And we started writing a new chapter for his thesis, for this new book. And, you know, in this past summer, I have pretty much completed the revisions at this point. I'm putting the finishing touches on this book. So God willing, inshallah, this should come out maybe fall of next year, or at least the spring of 2023. So that's not necessarily my own work, but it's a project where I'm trying to bring into the world Suhaib's book, now that he's passed. The other book, though, my own personal project, is another theological work. It is an attempt to try to address from a Muslim perspective, one of ethics and theology, how can we as a Muslim community understand and engage with the problems of mass displacement, right, the refugee crisis, and global white supremacy, racism, modern structural racism. It is more broadly a look at what does systemic evil look like, but then taking the examples of displacement and racism and trying to say, this is how we can understand it when we look into our tradition. We can look into our ethical resources, the examples of the prophets, into the stories of our past to both understand what's happening in the world now, but also how to confront it as people of faith, as a community of faith. And so that's my other project, which I've put on hold because of this book with Suhaib. But inshallah, I should be getting back to that soon.
Wonderful. Good luck with everything, Doctor. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and give this excellent discussion on writing. And with that, I'd like to conclude the episode.
Thank you very much for having me.